lecture, and then to recognize the wife of Dr. Soso, more affectionately called that way, Alfia Sorhaindo, and her family, and his brother, Rupert Sorhaindo, Professor Grell, a colleague, the CEO of the Dominica Social Security, Mrs. Thomas, Mr. Augustus Etienne, the deputy of the Dominica Social Security, my marketing and outreach officer, Ms. Kimon Joseph, and other distinguished persons among us. As always, I'm so elated when I see the usual core. I reassured Professor Waldron that we will have a fair crowd, not necessarily because he went on the it was the hot seat this morning. And we're almost certain that everyone is listening to the hot seat, and hence we will get a crowd. But this is not the hot seat crowd. This is the genuine crowd that always patronizes the University of the West Indies Open Campus, and we're so happy that you are here tonight. I need now, in my welcome, I say my welcome, but actually it's the welcome of someone who's here in spirit, and really wish that he was here. And he called just about 20 minutes ago to say to me, Wilson, did you get my welcome address? Because I didn't get a feedback by email. I said I did, and that would never be left out. It is that which is written by the acting director of the University of West Indies Open Campus. He represents all the, you may say, the UE12 outside the bricks and mortar campus of St. Augustine, Mona, and Kayville. And there he writes, Dr. Francis Severin, it is again my pleasure to welcome you to another distinguished public lecture, on this occasion, the 5th annual Dr. Bernard A. Sorhaindo Memorial Lecture. At the onset, I must express my thanks to our collaborators, the Dominica Social Security. We appreciate this partnership, not for the first time. The Dr. Bernard A. Sorhaindo Memorial Lecture was launched Thursday, July 24, 2008 at this Fort Young Hotel with a lecture on occupational respiratory diseases delivered by Dr. Sundar Sandhu, Assistant Professor of Medicine, Department of Medicine, Yale University of Medicine, New Haven, Connecticut. The second lecture on Tuesday, September 15, 2009, again at the Fort Young Hotel, was delivered by Professor the Honorable Sir George Allen, Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, a Director Emeritus of the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO. And probably I should pause here to say that we now have a Dominican, daughter of the soil, the second Caribbean or CARICOM national to head that organization in Dr. Carissa Etienne. And you will find out later, a student of Professor Waldron, that was one of his students, as many other students who attended be it Mona or St. Augustine, or Mona particularly, where he lectured for a number of years. The subject then was wisdom, wealth, and wellness. We had a bonus in 2010, a double lecture delivered by Dr. Paul Ricketts and Dr. Leslie Walwyn on the topics, respectively, the chronic non-communicable disease epidemic, a possible solution for Dominica, and conquering chronic non-communicable diseases in children, Antigua's battle. The fourth lecture on September 29, 2011 We were privileged to have with us a professor of medicine and clinical pharmacology, retired Dean of Medical Sciences, former public orator of the Kayville campus, and Barbados National Public Orator, Professor Henry Fraser. He spoke to us on the topic, "The health of the nation is the wealth of the nation, but what is health and how do we achieve it?" We are proud to continue this fine tradition of distinguished and prominent lecturers this year with another eminent gentleman and scholar, Professor Sir Errol R. Waldron, Professor Emeritus at the University of the West Indies, an honorary consultant at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. His subject, Professional Ethics, a Community and Professional Responsibility, is equally relevant, and some may argue even more relevant than any other, in light of the fact that how we conduct ourselves as professionals and as laypersons is inextricably bound to the quality of life, not only of ourselves, but our community in whatever sphere we engage. The role of professional ethics, we may argue, is particularly important in the field of health. Allow me to quote Professor Waldron in his book, Ethical Practice in Everyday Healthcare, who argues that while the applied aspects of ethics vary between professions, occupations, and roles, they should underline the professional conduct and responsibilities of all, but especially university-trained human resources. Thus, according to him, the law is distinct from ethics. Law is used to emphasize and enforce those areas of ethical conduct that are agreed upon and defined. The law, however, can only act as a framework for settling differences in those areas of professional conduct where there is no consensus, and in areas that are disputed but have not been resolved. There is therefore an interface between ethical conduct and the law that must be constantly borne in mind, even in emergency situations. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a significant point in the context of this present conversation. What is legal may not necessarily be ethical, and it is quite possible to argue what is ethical may not be necessarily legal. The area of sexuality and sexual behavior tends to illustrate this quite well, and is often drawn upon so to do. As Waldron in 2005 said, or argued, society at times attempt to circumvent moral and ethical issues and opt for what is often termed the pragmatic approach. Hence, he continues, it is vital that right and wrong practice within health and healthcare be kept under constant review, not only within the traditional healthcare professions, but through the wider lens of social, legal, and religious concerns. Ladies and gentlemen, as I have emphasized in the past, this is not merely about Dr. Bernard A. Sorhaindo, as much as preserving a legacy for our nation of ethical, honest, and professional medical practice and community service. The University of the West Indies Open Campus Dominica and the Dominica Social Security are both pleased to be associated with such a legacy. Speaking of legacy, it is my unyielding belief that as the region's top university, we must always be committed to our role as educators, scholars, researchers, and community workers. The university's remit is not to give comfort to any particular group or class. The university is not a commonplace and ordinary institution, nor is it comprised of ordinary and commonplace people. Hence, it cannot engage in the ordinary and commonplace. Its role is a midwifery one, that is, to assist in delivering the region from its social, economic, political, and I dare say ethical conundrum. This is not an ordinary or commonplace exercise, and certainly not the role of the faint-hearted. At the University of the West Indies, we must always be guided by this if we are not to lose our claim to unlocking the West Indian potential for economic and cultural growth. Tonight, we continue the tradition of unlocking potential, and therefore, we look forward with alacrity to hearing Professor Sir Errol Waldron speak to the subject, Professional Ethics, a Community, and Professional Responsibility. I take this opportunity to convey to our guests of honor my sincere apologies for my absence tonight, but I know he will understand the exigencies of the job and regional travel. I am confident that the acting head and staff of the Dominica site and our Dominican audience will extend to him a warm nature island of Dominica welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me recognize the presence of Professor Sir Errol R. Waldron, our guest lecturer this evening, Monsignor Eustace Thomas, Parish Priest of St. Alphonsus, Mrs. Althea Sorhaindo, wife of deceased Dr. Bernard Sorhaindo and other members of the Sorhaindo family, Mrs. Janice Jean-Jacques Thomas, Executive Director of the Dominica Social Security, and other members of the management and staff of. Let me say on behalf of the board, management and staff of the Dominica Social Security, how pleased we are to be associated with this, the Dr. Bernard Sorhaindo Memorial Lecture Series, and that we are equally delighted to join in welcoming our guest lecturer, Professor Sir Errol R. Waldron, to the Nature Isle of Dominica. Our pleasure stems from the fact that, by its very intent, this lecture series seeks to perpetuate the memory of an illustrious son of the soil, the late Dr. Bernard A. Sorhaindo, who happened to have been Dominica's, or the first Dominican to have graduated from the University of the West Indies, and who, during his professional practice, collaborated with the Dominica Social Security in the capacity of a medical referee for a period of time. You know that the Dominica Social Security is a program of national insurance that is charged with the responsibility of collecting contributions from workers with a view to paying them cash benefits when they suffer from certain contingencies that are covered under the program. Two of those contingencies, when a person is deemed permanently unable to work or a person is suffering from a disability that arose out of the course of their work. These persons, by nature of the condition that they suffer from, are by law required to undergo periodic review by a medical person to evaluate whether in fact they continue to satisfy the condition for receipt of those benefits. And Dr. Sorhaindo, during his practice, served us in that capacity by reviewing some of our recipients of these two benefits and advising us on their continued entitlement or eligibility for those benefits. We are also delighted to be associated with this series because we are of the view that the topics chosen for these lectures serve to promote a higher level of public discourse. And I dare say that tonight's topic, professional ethics, a community, and professional responsibility, is no exception. In fact, we deem this topic to be rather timely, as it brings into sharp focus the need for all of us, irrespective of our fields of endeavor, to honor and uphold the code of ethics of our particular professions, whether we are lawyers or accountants, doctors or engineers, nurses or teachers, in whatever field we are engaged. We are called upon to uphold and honor the code of ethics of our particular professions. It is only by doing so that we can ensure we can continue to work in the best interest both of our respective professions and that of the wider community that we serve. Thus, to the extent that our stakeholders, that is social security stakeholders, are able to observe professional ethics in the fulfillment of their respective roles relative to the functioning of that institution that we administer, our work would be rendered much easier and the social well-being of our populace would be better assured. I therefore look forward to an interesting and thought-provoking lecture and trust that the ensuing discussions will be fruitful. Thank you for the courtesy of your attention.
I need now to introduce our guest speaker, and bear with me because I think it is morally correct to mention, and maybe a little embarrassed, but I need to do just that. Professor Sir Errol R. Waldron, CHB, KA, and we're given the opportunity to explain what each of these acronyms mean. Professor Emeritus, University of the West Indies, BSc Honors, Anatomy, LRCP, MRCS, MBBS, I'm familiar with this one, FRCS, FACS, and FCCOS. So you're wondering, probably, we should associate just S's with his name. Plural. Professor Errol, consultant of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. He received his medical education from Guy's Hospital Medical School in London from 1954 to 1960. He became a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Britain in 1964. He has authored 140 refereed publications. From 1996 to 1977, Professor Waldron was lecturer at the University of the West Indies. At the University of the West Indies, he has served as Dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Barbados and from 2WI Caville campus. Professor Waldron's dedication to fighting the spread of HIV and AIDS is evident in his work on many communities designed to plan the Management Committee of the WHO Global Program on AIDS and the National AIDS Advisory Council in Barbados. He has
Mr. Sorhaindo and family, Monsignor Thomas, Justice Aline, Professor Burrell and Karen, other distinguished persons and colleagues, and I dare say a sprinkling of patience. It is a great honor that you have invited me from that sort of flatland of Barbados to these ethereal mountains of Dominica to speak at such an occasion in memory of such a distinguished son of the soil. And it's particularly fortunate that I'm here to celebrate with you the ascension of Carissa Etienne to being director of PAHO. I remember her well as a student. She always disarmed you with her smile, and that solved most things for her. I met Dr. Sorhaindo on several visits I made to this Green Isle in the early 70s, and he was already a legend, being one of those several isolated specialist practitioners that were up and down the islands who served their populations so well and with such dedication. When I met him, I realized that we would have trained in medicine, although at different schools in the same University of London. around the same period. And we would have learned the science of medicine and the essence of good conduct towards patients, as still happens today. However, that conduct was not formally taught at that time. We were supposed to absorb it from our seniors, or we were supposed to have brought it in with us by being the son of a doctor. I say son because there were so few women in those days. Or we came from a good family, or you were perhaps an altar boy in the church. But you needed those qualifications, and that said you were going to be a good doctor and have good conduct. And I say to myself that if these qualifications really worked, we really shouldn't have any complaints about the ethical conduct in the medical profession. For even as we've democratized the entry into medical school, and persons come from all walks of life, there should still remain the example of the seniors in medical school and in practice to give that good example. Yet, in spite of that, we hear increasing complaints that not all doctors are acting ethically. And trainers, as I was and still do some of it, we are asked to account for this. Why aren't the young doctors acting more ethically? As we examine the complaints that we hear, you realize that the social origins of those entering schools is not enough to explain any poor conduct by some members of the profession. We are in a changing world, one in which there's an expectation that doctors will get rich quickly. People are absorbed in the dramas portrayed on medical television shows, where you see the conduct of doctors portrayed, but that's made for television. And then there's the evidence of the increase in malpractice complaints and claims. One also notices that although the majority of complaints come about a few doctors, and I got that impression in Dominica this morning in the program I was on, but the entire profession is put under scrutiny. So today, therefore, when young doctors are prepared for their role in the world today, they need to be very good in the science of medicine and to be equally rigorously prepared to act ethically and legally. Well, I recall when Dr. Sorhaindo and myself would have been students, that's 50 years and more ago. The ethical and legal conduct we were taught amounted to not having sex with your patient, not persuading an old lady to leave you everything in her will and then help her along to St. Peter. We were taught to deceive our patients for their own good, but to work without sleep, day in and day out, to save their lives. We heard of the occasional doctor who was put in jail for doing abortions, but our eye was directed more at the unqualified backstreet abortionists who endangered young women's lives. We were expected to swear by the Hippocratic Oath when we became doctors. And this exhorted us, amongst a number of things, to uphold the principles of justice and confidentiality as we did good and tried to do no harm. At that time, I was also made aware of the atrocities that had been committed by doctors in the Second World War in the German detention camps. But you know, all I remembered about that was that I shouldn't make a lampshade out of people's skins. A new world of ethical conduct was to have been ushered in after the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi doctors. Guidelines were formulated for the conduct of research on human subjects, and the Hippocratic Oath was modernized into an oath of fidelity that included the principles enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declared in 1948. Nevertheless, some of us in the medical profession seem to have absorbed little of this, for within a few years of these declarations, experiments were being conducted, breaking all the new rules. In one, now I would say notorious example, ethnic minorities seeking health care were left untreated to just see the effects of what would be syphilis going untreated. And many other ethically challenged experiments have been conducted on captive personnel like prisoners and army personnel. And it wasn't that the doctors involved had not heard about the new rules or that they were doing wrong, for they went to great lengths to conceal what they were doing. What was clear is that there was so little regard for the persons as fellow human beings that niceties such as ethical conduct did not stand in the way of gaining knowledge, as they said, but more likely fame and fortune. It is a reflection of better education, the promises of the Declaration on Human Rights, and particularly the global penetration of communication technologies, that we have seen a change in the attitude of people towards the professionals who serve them. And that change has occurred in medicine, in law, in the church, in teaching, and in business. And many of the professionals in those areas appear unprepared to be face the challenge and face being challenged by their clients. In medicine, undoubtedly, scientific advances have left health professionals much better prepared to face the challenges presented by disease. Still, a lot of disease and illness remains vague, and inevitably we hear complaints that doctors do not act ethically as they should in relation to such matters as sick leave, as we heard earlier on. Most professionals today really act as their mentors did. However, they're now practicing as if they're in a fishbowl. They're under scrutiny, a level of scrutiny that was not there before. Now, members of the professions respond in different ways when challenged. And the responses are usually an attempt to try and retain what was the traditional power, or what they think was the traditional power they had within the society. What one may see in that deployment of power by professionals is that they do so without exercising the responsibility that goes along with ethical conduct. Responsibility and power in a community must be exercised at both a personal as well as an institutional and corporate level. And if you reflect, you can think of many examples in our different spheres of life where responsibilities are set aside because they appear to be too hard, or you don't want a particular conduct to come to light. In our field, one may not say no to a patient who asks for an antibiotic or sick leave, simply because you're afraid that they won't come and with their custom to you later on. One may ask for expensive investigations just to show that you're modern, or to ensure that you pay for the piece of equipment that you bought and put in your office. Some time ago, there was an interesting exchange of correspondence in the press in Barbados that caught my eye. A patient complained that he had gone to the doctor's office with an urgent complaint, and the doctor has refused to see him. And this ignited a debate in the press, an exchange of letters. And one doctor claimed that there was no contractual obligation to see a patient simply because the person came in through their door. Others argued that a doctor's office was like any other business, where you invited a customer in to purchase the services, and you had no right to turn them arbitrarily away. And as I read this correspondence, I said to myself, well, what spurious legalities have we lost as doctors all perspective in relation to one's professional duties to provide aid, particularly in an emergency? Because not providing aid in a genuine emergency probably could not be defended if harm had come to a patient. On the other hand, when this was put forward, doctors argued that others had been sued for coming to the aid of someone by the roadside when they did not have all the necessary equipment with them. And they said, look, I am not willing to go to court and rely on any Good Samaritan rule. So we've come to a situation where there's an argument going on between the professions and the public as to what their duties should be, even when it comes to emergencies. So as we think about this, how would we get the public to have confidence that doctors, or any other professional for that matter, are acting ethically? It is clear to me as a former teacher that one would not only have to influence students, but their teachers and their role models as well. Now, we think influencing students in the short term of their training is doable. Influencing the persons who know it all already is not so easy, a much more difficult task. However, if one could influence the patients and others in the community to know what is right and wrong in the relationship between the professionals and their clients, it would be much easier to get the whole thing right, because each side would have a knowledge of what is right and wrong. When we start thinking about a code of this sort, ethical conduct for the doctors goes back to the 4th century Hippocratic Oath, although I was reminded today that there are more ancient texts, and that's true. But we are not stuck in the 4th century. We are not even at the point of the oath of fidelity that was formulated 60 years ago. Ethical conduct is a slowly changing consensus between the professions and the community, and it is honed by the law through changes in statute and precedent as it comes down from the bench. Therefore, in a sense, we have to undo the commonly held idea that ethical conduct is a simple set of rules based in some way on religious belief. It is not that religions do not inform ethical conduct. It is how one can combine so many different religious views into a coherent framework on matters that are crucial to any individual who is seeking medical advice and services. One really has to develop a framework for reaching ethical decisions that will be satisfactory to the plurality of people as a community, but also to each individual, taking into account their beliefs, and of course to the professionals who serve them. Such a framework has to be underpinned by the law, professional regulations, institutional vigilance for both patients and professionals, and dialogue at the community level. And I don't suppose the dialogue should always take the form of the morning program we had today. Therefore, I'm putting forward the proposition that any ethical code of conduct has to be understandable and acceptable to both the professions and the public. To achieve this, it has to be a thoughtful process as the professional deals with the variety of problems that present themselves. Now, the basic principles on which modern ethical conduct is based are, there are four of them: beneficence, to do good; non-malfeasance, namely do no harm. And it's important that they sound just like turning the card over. But so often in medicine, as we treat and we give drugs, or we do surgeries, or we do some other procedure, which we intend to do good, we may also do harm. And that interface is a very one that has to be carefully thought through and regulated. And then there is autonomy, which is a new concept to many professionals and the public. And that is the right of the persons to decide what is done to them and also by them. You, the patient, have the right to say, you recommend this, but I do not want to have that done. And the professional has the right to say, look, you may want this done, but I am not doing that because I don't think it's the right thing to do. And the fourth principle is justice. And I always remember when I use this, I remember a former Prime Minister of Barbados who said that if you wanted justice, you did not go to the courts. But justice in this sense is a much broader concept than what goes on in the courts. And it is in the courts, as the patients have recourse to the law if something goes wrong. But justice embraces the broader concept of the rights of the patients. For instance, the right of a person to access care irrespective of their social or economic standing. I suspect Mr. Bam is dealing with that even tonight. The right to get care irrespective of their ethnicity or their place of origin. The right to their religious and cultural expressions, providing, of course, that those religious and cultural expressions do not infringe the law or the rights of others. Now, one of the illustrations of these principles is in the area of abortion, which has been a controversial area of ethics since the time of Hippocrates. Hippocrates himself advocated against providing any abortive remedy. Many religions see it as a violation of the sanctity of life. Some to the point that there should be no impediment to the conception of life. Historically, the law and the church were often in sync. And the voices of women who carried the life in their womb often had no say about their feelings or even their health or welfare. But as women have become more assertive about control of their own destiny and their bodies, many have been prepared to break the law and circumvent their religious upbringing to prevent conception, and failing that, to procure an abortion. Now, procuring an illegal abortion carries lethal risks. And in many countries, it became the biggest cause of deaths among young women. And it is at this interface of religious teaching and lives at risk that ethical conduct is tested, and I think perhaps best illustrated. A health professional who may have a deep conviction about the sanctity of human life from a religious standpoint should not stand in judgment over the choice of a woman who may have chosen to have an abortion and now has her own life at risk and is in need of care. In countries where abortions have been legalized within certain parameters, health professionals have been given the right of conscientious objection. It's the only other area that people have been given the right of conscientious objection is not to go to war and kill somebody else. They've been given the right of conscientious objection to taking part in an abortion. However, that right does not mean that they can block the lawful right of the patient to have an abortion by other willing health professionals. Similarly, a health professional cannot use their religious beliefs to deny their professional services to those who they think are criminals, have a same-sex orientation which they don't agree with, or even do not subscribe to the same God that they do. Now, applying the 4 ethical principles I mentioned earlier on to medical practice have come at a time when the professions have been accustomed. These 4 principles came about when the professions were accustomed to a very paternalistic approach to their patients and clients. The doctors knew best. The law was what a panel of arguing lawyers, I almost said quarreling, arguing lawyers eventually said it was. And sometimes they take an awful long time to tell you what it is. And any conduct by a priest could only be dealt with in whispers. The professionals were kings in our community. But as people have become more knowledgeable and more assertive and demanding for knowledge about their own condition and affairs, they're asking for more and more accountability from the professions, and not just in medicine alone. In fact, I dare say that people are asking whether these emperors have any clothes. When we discuss professional conduct, one has to be conscious, certainly in medicine, but in other spheres of the profession, that competition within the corporate culture of professional practice today challenges good conduct. For more and more focus is being placed on one's economic bottom line. One of my colleagues used to argue very forcibly that we should not discuss ethics without recognizing that greed was the most powerful motivating force in human behavior. Now, we may not agree where this will lead us and what path it's on, But certainly I think we can say that as medicine has become more scientifically equipped, it has also become more commercially oriented, both at an individual level and at the corporate level. And therefore, modern medical ethical conduct has to be put in the context of a medical industrial complex that grows over the heads of the professionals and providers of care to call patients on your televisions, to demand a particular drug from your doctor, or to use a particular set of equipment. But then there's the fine print at the bottom of the screen and the 10 seconds quickly of saying, well, if anything goes wrong, go and blame the doctor. Medicine is not only more business orientated, it has become a lot more complex, with tasks being conducted by other health professionals and other health workers. However, in a number of instances, those other professionals or health workers do not have the same legal or ethical obligations that the medical practitioners have. And this can create some problems. In our small Caribbean islands, unlike some of the metropoles, there are still many practitioners who work in solo practice. And they can carry sole responsibility for the ethical conduct within their practice and perhaps the small staff they have. But when one moves from being a sole practitioner to working in an organization or an institution with other workers and professionals, one of the things that one realizes, everyone should know how the other should behave. And we very seldom meet that standard. What we have developed instead are institutions that are made up of groups of workers who see themselves as distinct entities. They have their own rules of conduct. They meet together and discuss their own affairs, and then come out and declare to the public that they are working in the best interests of the organization and the patients. But they're working separately. The modern hospital is really a very good example of a large number of self-motivated groups and professions. And sometimes the patient is unfortunate enough to fall between the cracks between these professional groups as they practice their separate entities. And therefore, I would propose that a modern hospital practice, if it is to best serve the patients, has to develop a code of ethics and conduct that should be written to embrace all categories of staff, from the porter right up to the CEO. And such a code should be available to staff and patients, and it has to be seen to benefit patients and not just those who serve them. In this way, one should be able to get across how some of the more problematic issues are to be handled. For instance, a lot of people have problems with the principles and limitations of confidentiality. And how do you distinguish it from secrecy? A lot of people do not understand what informed consent really means. Therefore, such a code needs to value the work of each individual rather than having them being in competition. And if such a code could be drawn up and seen to be workable, I think it will apply or could be applied to other different spheres in our lives. And particularly, we need codes like that to help govern the professions that societies have given the privilege of governing themselves. because it is at that interface where you hear most complaints. You hear, oh, them doctors will all protect themselves, the lawyers don't do anything but complaints, the police certainly don't, the church is shut down. If there's a complaint, you just cannot penetrate these organizations. It is only then if we can work out a code together, only then will we have less lack of confidence of the public in the ethical conduct of the self-policing mechanisms of our professions. Mr. Chairman, I think I could be drawn into the wider spheres of ethical conduct, but I have to remind myself that we are only on this earth for a short time. And therefore, we need to use this, our brief tendency to forge a better, more just community for the people that we are going to leave behind. I thank you very kindly for your attention, and I dare say your indulgence. Thank you very much.
Like myself, you were present, you heard it all, and a few takeaways you may say. I understand better that ethical, professional behavior, or ethical behavior by different professions really lies in morality, and it governs the way people behave. And there is Sir Waldron looking for a, what do I call, a code of ethics that is universal and would apply to each and every one of us. But as he rightly said, his stay, like mine and yours, is so short. Code of conduct for all is a work in progress. At this stage, I would like to invite any one of you to ask some questions of Professor Sir Errol Waldron, and he will morally give the answers, I hope, using his code. Or if you are to make comments to complement what was said, although I thought it was complete, please let them be brief. Who will take the first knock? Dr. Riviere. Okay.
He wants to.
Sorry, there's a roving mic.
First of all, let me congratulate my old professor on this beautiful lecture. I myself have been involved in ethics and was very impressed for principles which you mentioned, especially the last principle of justice. What I'm interested though also is what would be your actual reaction to the situation which you mentioned in Barbados. You know, for example, that in France, a physician coming across an accident is by law obliged to stop and render assistance. And in the US, this also happens in a sort of way. Where we can stop, but if we are not fully equipped to help, then the responsibility to shift to somebody else. But if your case in Barbados, I can understand that if we are in a situation in an emergency room in a hospital, and the patient comes in, then the physicians, medical staff want to give assistance. This is what happens in the United States too. But in your case where the patient practically came to the doctor's office with what terms an emergency, does the doctor really have to look after him when, in fact, his medical office is not equipped to keep an emergency? This is my question.
Yes, and that is exactly the question. The thing that struck me was that the complaint was made in the press. And it made you wonder how urgent was the complaint. And I think in complaints like that, you're having an interplay. You're having a complaint, and sometimes, if you do get a complaint, one of the things that the regulatory body should be doing is to really try and tease out what is the truth in relation to the complaint. The fact is, the question of somebody coming into your office, and what has to take the argument, if you've opened your office and you've said all can come, that is one thing. If you've said people can only come by appointment, that is another. And it is one of those areas that people haven't thought through until something like this happens. I think that you have to think about it when you do open your office, what it is that you are saying to people. Because if you are inviting them to come in with anything at any time, as long as the door is open, then I think you have an obligation to attend to it.
Doctor, you mentioned four areas of ethical areas: to do good, autonomy, and justice. I think I missed out one.
To do no harm. Well, that's the point I wanted to make, that it sounds as if it's the other side of a card. But in medicine, that's not quite the same. And similarly in the law, I think. Because as you set out to do good, because of the interventions that you are employing to do good, you may end up doing harm. So that you have to be very careful, and this is where the science of medicine comes in. And because the science of medicine is still not exact, is much better than it was before, that interface has to be given thought every time. One of the areas that is coming increasingly under scrutiny is the area where there's a drug interaction, and particularly where patients go to different doctors and they are given one drug, they're taking it, and then they go to another doctor, they're given another drug for perhaps a different complaint. And sometimes it's because patients have been, in a sense, invited by the system to go to this one for their bellyache and that one for the heartache, and so on. And you get different drugs, and they may have severe interactions. And therefore, you intended to do good, but you may do severe harm. Yes.
Good evening, Dr. Waldron. I don't know if you recognize me. You performed the first operation on me. In 1981.
We're both 30 years older.
I want to congratulate you.
Thank you very much.
And also, coincidentally, the second operation performed on me was by Dr. Sorhaindo. He was the guy.
Well, there are a number of jokes about gynecologists and eyes, but I wouldn't be involved with those.
And thirdly, I want to ask if you convey greatest respect and regard to your wife, Beverly,
who
shared chambers with me in Barbados at the age of students.
Right, yes.
My question is, how do you look at the situation where doctors operating in a hospital, doctors who do not speak one word of English, but operate in an English hospital? How do you?
Well, you weren't part of the questioning audience this morning, but this is obviously a problem that seems to be here in Dominica at present. But let me just put it this way. Every country should have regulations about the qualifications to enter the register of professionals working in the country. And I think that one of the things that you will see most countries would have is that to enter a medical register, that they would have to be able to speak the language in the country. Because, and that is for the reason that they have to communicate with patients. And I can't tell what's wrong with you if I can't understand what you're telling me. All right? It may be different if you're a veterinary doctor. Now, having said that, there are obviously some situations where the patient is diagnosed and we know what procedure needs to be done, and you may invite expertise from outside, which is not part of the general, to do a particular procedure. Even then you require, I think, a translator so that that person can at least make some contact with the patient. But the patient would have had a doctor who could communicate with them properly in making that diagnosis. Now, there are other situations where, in fact, especially in our situation in the Caribbean, where we are having tourists, or we are inviting tourists to come in, where people are going to come to you as patients, having come in from, let's say, a Spanish-speaking country, and you don't know a word of Spanish if you're a doctor. You still have to communicate with them and to diagnose them. And there is when you might need to have a translator. But I would think that that has to be seen as the exception rather than the rule. That the doctor really, if they are on the medical register and expected to see the people of the country, there should be a regulation which says that they should speak the language of the country to be on the general register.
Dr. Waldron, Professor Waldron, thank you for this beautiful presentation, stimulating presentation tonight. I have two comments, or questions rather, that speak to doctors, though I want to comment my many nurse and midwifery colleagues here tonight. The first one is, could you speak to the doctor's duty to provide other options to the patient when the patient refuses the one that's been offered? And two, what are your experiences or comments to doctors who give one standard of care to the rich and mighty who they perceive is able to file a lawsuit compared to the care that they provide for the less fortunate who they perceive cannot file a lawsuit if they malpractice? Thank you.
Well, I think the second one is easy to deal with. As I said earlier on, everyone should have access, irrespective of their economic or social standing. And access in that sense does not just mean being able to get through the door. It means getting the same diagnostic and treatment advice. But then that comes into your first question, because in treatment there are often a number of alternatives. First of all, in this day and age of autonomy, rather than the old days of I know best and I will just tell you what to do, the alternatives, both the advantages and disadvantages of particular treatments, should be given. And one of the advantages or disadvantages, as you know, is what some treatments may cost. All right? But you need to be able to present those to patients, and they will then, on that basis, make an informed decision. Now, sometimes, of course, people who are better endowed economically will make different choices, all right? But everyone should be, in a sense, offered what is available. What happens, and it's a dilemma when we are trying to operate in small countries and small economies, is sometimes thinking that you must keep the options open to what is available locally. And one needs to be very careful about that, and I think sometimes as we operate in small countries, we have a much greater responsibility to think some of these things through than they are in the richer countries, which can waste resources, and sometimes we are scrounging for resources.
Thank you, Sir, for an excellent presentation on a very difficult topic. I was glad that you emphasized or you distinguished between ethics and law, because while codes of ethical conduct are, in a sense, law, ethics goes well beyond
That's right.
Codes of conduct. And I'd also like to make the point that ethics is not only limited to professionals. And that's often an issue that arises, whether outside of the professions there is a need for ethical standards and ethical conduct. So I think you made that point clearly when you distinguish between ethics and law. I also was struck by the point you made on autonomy, both the autonomy of the client and of the professional. And I would emphasize that just as the professional has the right to refuse to comply with the wishes of the client, if he's convinced that this is not the right thing to do, likewise the client would have the right to refuse the advice and the treatment that the professional recommends. And in medical terms, this would be perhaps particularly germane when you look at the issue of abortion. But the main thing I want to say tonight relates to the issue that ethical standards apply independently of legal regimes, whether statutory regimes of law or whether professional standards of ethics, and that ethical standards apply within and outside of professions. that every public activity, if you like, ought to be subject to ethical issues and standards. And we often forget this and think that only lawyers and doctors are subject to ethical standards. Maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Well, one of the points I tried to make is that, yes, we are most familiar with ethics as it applies to professions, but if we are going to make the situation better and have less complaints, one has to get the public and the professions understanding the same thing. And therefore, the public needs to understand that they have not only rights, but they also have responsibilities in the relationship. So, and that's really the essence of ethical conduct. They also have to understand. And this is where I think we are challenged as communities. We have really now to, the public is aware that things can go wrong and that they can complain, even although they don't necessarily complain through the right channels all the time. But we now have to be able to educate them as well as to what are the rights and limitations in the relationship they have with professionals. And in that way, I think we will be able to go ahead. Now, I personally think that we can, in fact, start that path by trying to correct what I see as a great dysfunction in our institutions, and particularly our hospitals, where our separate professional groups have, because they want to exercise their own autonomy and to be seen as professionals in their own right, have really sort of channeled themselves in their own paths. And although they speak about the whole organization, you have these separate kingdoms. And you really have to have that interface. And the only way I think that can do that is to try and get some unified code of conduct.
Thoroughly enjoying your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. On the question of the deontology of professions generally, okay, we know that deontology refers to a code of rules or code of conduct, but rules whereby individual is guided in his behavior and his actions. Okay? I'd like to know for the medical profession, let us say, because that's where we are tonight. Who makes the rules for the profession? Is it self-policed? Doctors make the rules for doctors follow, unless the medical professionals follow, or some other body? And we know it's not the legislature as such, because you have spoken of the distinction between law and morals. So, but who makes the rules for the medical profession? Can they be self-policed?
Well, yeah, sorry. Yes. No, what has happened is that there has been no hard and fast rule as to who makes the rules. And therefore we had the medical profession speaking that they were adhering to the Hippocratic Oath, although many of them didn't know what it said, for 4 centuries. And then we had this change after the Second World War, where a group of doctors mainly got together after the trial of the doctors to say, well, let's have a new set of rules, all right? But they are all self-policing. One of the things that I think has to happen more generally in these self-policing professions is that the lay public has to come in on the regulatory mechanisms.
Exactly. So, is there a role for some kind of a watchdog commission? In other areas of watchdog?
Certainly the professions, most of them have in law some regulatory mechanism. For instance, in medicine there's a medical council, or sometimes it's called a board. And that usually has been only the professions, members of the profession. What I'm saying is that one needs to get lay people on those councils or boards to be able to start that dialogue between the professions and the public.
And one last question. I want to just address you find that people who practice the alternative medicines usually criticize or reproach the Western chemical medicines of professions of treating the symptom rather than the disease. Ethically, if you know that you're only treating the symptom, isn't that, in a sense, refusing a certain amount of care to a patient if you know that you're only treating the symptom and not the disease, when the patient expects that you are doing something more fundamental for them?
Sometimes this is the pot calling the kettle black, huh? What we have is a history. We are talking about the evolution of so-called Western medicine, which has tried and has a voluminous literature trying to tease out treatments on a more scientific basis. That is absent from a number of the other alternatives. Now, the science is not as exact as the mathematical sciences. It is not as exact as the new iPhone, the i5 phone or whatever it is. It isn't as exact as that. All right? But there is that striving to be more scientific. What I find with a number of alternative medicines is that they have not strived to be that scientific, and you could argue about that forevermore. And some people would say that they talk about disparage Western medicine because you appear to be treating symptoms, and I personally think it's more than that, properly. But on the other hand, they are saying, yes, we're doing holistic medicine, but then if you ask them for scientific validation, it isn't there. It is not an easy thing to sort out. Not easy in any way.
If your pressure is high, coconut water line is very quickly.
Sorry, I didn't.
Coconut water line will drop your pressure very quickly. Well, I haven't measured my pressure when I've taken it, but I'm sure it does. My question is, a doctor can either retire or go away. And sometimes you've been with that doctor for 10 years or 5 years because you prefer to go to that doctor. What is the moral obligation and what is the right of the patient if that doctor goes away or retires and has all your medical records?
All right. This has some legal constructs. first of all, the records made are the property of the doctor. However, they are about you. And you can demand to have a copy of those records at any time you wish. All right? So if that doctor is retiring or going away and you wish to transfer to another service, you can either ask for the records to be passed on to whoever it is you are, or you can request a copy of your records.
The doctor has no moral obligation to say, well, I am closing down my records, here are your records, you can give to another doctor.
It is lying more in a legal obligation. I mean, and that's where it would lie, really. Mm-hmm.
You brought up 3 points where it claims that it is a moral, religious issue.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this women gain ground in that affects their bodies. But what about the child, this unborn child? I feel that it's past time that we start to blame grounds as what is to happen there. Because it's almost like if you have a person who's ill as no home, and it's a grievance to you, then you should go away then.
Well, this is a
baby who's actually just living in a prison, within a prison.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like in a prison, it's part of prison. Living there, born in there, should be destroyed. Because
and this is and this
I
is
say about looking to the future. I know it can't be solved now, but I thought it's something that looking into the future, that could be something that what will happen after 9 months should be started taking what will be done about that.
the point I tried to make, and perhaps I didn't make it explicit enough, is that this has been the dilemma all over the several millennia. All right? And people have thought about that unborn baby in different ways over the millennia, as we understood that unborn baby in different ways. Now, for instance, when Hippocrates talked about no abortive remedy, Hippocrates would not have known anything about a zygote, a just fertilized ovum. And today, the big debate that is going on about abortion relates to whether a zygote, a just fertilized ovum, is a person. I asked some medical students the other day, and just this question: when did you become a person? And it was interesting how uncomfortable they all were. One gave what I would call a medical answer out of the obstetric book, and she said, well, that's 28 weeks. And another gave what I would consider a modern religious answer and said, well, when I was a zygote. And when I asked them to examine the implications of these two answers, there was a great deal of difficulty. Well, the one who said, well, 28 weeks, knew what they meant by being a person, because they said, well, I could be independent of my mother if something happened to her, or if I... But the one who thought that she became a person as a zygote had no idea what this meant to be a person at that time. So I think this is going to be something that is going to be argued for still a long time to go. One of the interesting things when you say that a zygote is a person is whether you stop using the now accepted techniques of in vitro fertilization. Because what we do in those techniques is that a number of zygotes are created, but not all are put to come to grow in the woman's womb. And they're put in a freezer. And what happens with those zygotes that are put in a freezer? It's a big argument. Now, when we put those zygotes in a freezer, and eventually they say, well, we don't need them anymore, you put them down the sink. It isn't an abortion because you haven't plucked it out of the woman's womb, but you're saying that I've destroyed so many dozen persons. And there are lots of questions that we have to work through as communities when we start discussing these things. For instance, there was a situation in Australia where a couple were having an in vitro fertilization procedure, and they had these various zygotes in store, so to speak, and they died both died in a plane crash. And the executors of their will, they happened to be well off, made an application to court that at least one of these zygotes should be put into a woman's womb and brought together so that they could inherit the fortune. Now, these are questions that are not easily answered, and we have to discuss them as a community. And some communities are going to come to different conclusions from others. But they're questions that need to be discussed, and they're not easy ones. See, when does a person have property rights? That was the question. When you have a property right? It's a question that is still being asked even after we are independent out of our mother's womb. When do we have certain rights to do things that are not given otherwise in law?
Dr. Waldron.
Yes.
So the question, I think I want to just give you thumbs up for your lecture. But I have a question. One of the problems that we've been facing, I think, right now, which I think makes your lecture very timely, is that as I'm looking at professional ethics at format and professional responsibility, I want your views on what happened when you are in this sort of excitement, so you work alongside probably a medical doctor, and the treatment that you see them giving to the patients are not really, they're scared, but you give your input because you give the bedside care to the patient, and the way that you see the doctor deal with the patient, you are seeing that it's not for the patient's best interest. And you try to give your input, but because, as we say sometimes in Caribbean, that doctors word is gospel, you try and help out this person. I was saying about the situation, you try and give your input, and the doctor refuses to take into consideration what you're saying. What are your views on that?
Well, what you're illustrating there is what I would call an imbalance of power. You feel that something is going wrong, but you don't feel that you can challenge the power on the other side. Of course, you have to take into account that you may be wrong. But this is where I stress again that we need, as a community, to develop common mechanisms and common modes of conduct, which will involve confidential mechanisms that would allow you to bring this to the attention of all your efforts. You see, a code of conduct would help you in guiding you in how you could bring this to the attention of that person. Because that person would also, from that code of conduct, know that you are empowered to do so. All right? And then it would have some confidential mechanism. If that interface fails, that you can bring this up to attention to the powers that be. All right? Because there's always another power that be.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Again, thank you, Dr. Waldron. Interesting. Who's comment about the zygote? In nature, they say survival of the fittest. I propose tonight that it's probably survival of those who won't suffer as much. Just a proposal.
I'm sorry.
Nature, they say it's survival of the fittest.
Yes.
I propose to you as survival of those who won't suffer as much.
Mm-hmm.
There's a proposal. What do you think of stem cell research? And also, what do you think of the remote control operations that can take place today?
All right. Let me let me deal with the remote control operations first. That is simply another technique, and techniques have been advancing all the time, and that is simply another technique. What we have really is the difficulty where you may not see the person who is dealing with you. However, in most of those situations, there is always someone on site. Okay, so that's it. In terms of stem cell research, again, what we have is the dilemma that is faced by being declared a person when you are a zygote. Because we went along with in vitro fertilization. We worked out all of these techniques to have these zygotes. And since the techniques are not perfect, we did several, and therefore we have these zygotes all lying around. And once you have that, some other scientist is going to say, well, you know, instead of pushing these down the sink, is there something else we can do about it? And stem cell research is a natural outcome of that. And there you again come into an argument and a discussion that a community must have as a whole. The scientists are going to say to you, well, this is a good source for stem cells, and you know, we think we'll be able to do all sorts of wonderful good things if we can get these stem cells. But we don't know yet, because we haven't had it. All right? And therefore community, and this is a big discussion going on in Britain at the moment, and it has reached the legislature, to decide whether the community, whether you should continue to explore scientific advance, or whether you should say to yourself, well, we have decided that this zygote is a person, and therefore we must stop at this. All right? But that's a debate the community has to engage itself in. I could give you my personal view, but I think the community has to engage in this. And pardon? I don't think I was a person when I was a zygote.
What I would comment is that is one of these par excellence lectures, and knowing you would keep Sir Waldron here the entire night. But that's why UE has employed a marketing and outreach officer who knows when to bring a good thing to an end. And that is Kimon Joseph, who I'll now call upon to give the vote of thanks. Kimon.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening to everyone. I'd like to first of all, on behalf of the University of the West Indies Open Campus, thank Professor Sir Errol Waldron for coming to be our distinguished lecturer at this event. It has been an honor having you with us. Your presentation tonight was very detailed. You used practical and relevant examples, and you were able to show the shift in the paradigm of ethical issues over the years. And I appreciated that very much, and I'm sure our audience appreciated it as well. To the Dominica Social Security, the staff and management, we thank you very much for collaborating with us in this venture, and we hope that we can continue to depend on you to help with this lecture series. To the family of Dr. Bernard A. Sorhaindo, we thank you for your presence here this evening. We are very pleased that you welcomed our invitation to join us. As Mrs. Sorhaindo told us when we called, I'll always be there. So we thank you for coming. We thank Kyrie FM for the live broadcast so that those who could not be with us physically were able to listen via the airwaves. We thank the other members of the media who are here and who will report on this event. We thank the staff and the management of the Fort Young Hotel who have done a wonderful job in preparing the room for us for this event. We thank the medical professionals and healthcare professionals who are among us. I know there are many here who accepted our invitation and came to the lecture this evening, and we thank you for being here. And we thank everyone in the audience for coming out and for listening to the lecture and for participating, and those who are listening as well for participating. We invite you to our next lecture, which will be on October 4th, Thursday, October 4th, and that will be the inaugural E.O. Leblanc lecture, and that will be done by Dr. Orwin Bully. And so we invite you to that already, and that is going to be at 7:30 in this very room on the 4th of October. So thank you and good night.